Can you hear my voice?
Oke, Pak Dwi.
Apakah Prof. Peters sudah join? Atau kita buka dulu ya?
Kita mulai jam 7 atau jam setengah 7, Pak Dwi?
Setengah 7, Bu Marita. Karena kan di sana sudah daylight saving. Jadi di sana kan musim dingin biasanya maju 1 jam. Jadi yang tadinya jadwal sebelumnya adalah setengah 8, jadi maju di sini setengah 6, setengah 7. Tapi di sana sama, tetap setengah 8. Nanti silakan mahasiswa juga bisa on cam ya, untuk apa? Pada saat paparan oleh Prof. Peters. Ini Mas Fikri atau Mas Reza, kita mulai saja ya. Halo, Mas Reza. Oke, kalau begitu kita mulai saja sembari nunggu Prof. Peters untuk bergabung. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Syukur Alhamdulillah pada malam hari ini kita bersama-sama akan menghadiri kuliah umum oleh Profesor Guy Peters. Beliau adalah scholar yang sangat terpandang di dunia, khususnya dalam isu-isu masalah globalisasi, kemudian institusi dan neoliberalisme. Jadi ini menarik, dan kemudian kita mengharapkan nanti dalam kegiatan ini kita akan banyak apa namanya mendapat berinteraksi. Izinkan saya sebagai MC sekaligus moderator. Pertama-tama saya akan menyampaikan dalam 2 bahasa, tapi nanti ketika Pak Peter sudah gabung, saya akan banyak berbahasa Inggris. Izinkan saya menjelaskan urutan acara kita pada malam hari ini. Yang pertama nanti adalah pembukaan, kemudian selanjutnya adalah sambutan dari Ibu Marita Diana, Ketua Departemen Administrasi Publik Universitas di Yogyakarta. kemudian dilanjutkan dengan paparan oleh Prof. Guy Peters yang waktunya kurang lebih 35 menit. Selanjutnya nanti ada sesi tanya jawab. Dan kemudian nanti diakhiri dengan closing statement dari beliau dan penutupan acara. Demikian kurang lebih urutan acara kita pada malam hari ini. Untuk mengawali, marilah kita buka dengan berdoa sesuai dengan agama dan kepercayaan masing-masing. Semoga kuliah ini memberikan manfaat, pengetahuan, dan pemahaman yang baik bagi kita, khususnya dalam isu-isu masalah teori institusi dan kemudian public administrasi publik di Indonesia. Berdoa dipersilakan. Berdoa diakhiri. Okay. I'm not sure I saw a picture, but the Ratan is Adrian Ahmad Berlian. But I think it's Professor Peter, isn't it? Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, in Indonesia, and very good morning for Peters in Pittsburgh, because we have about 11 time caps, and we are 11 hours earlier than in Pittsburgh. So hopefully it's good for Prof. Peters to wake up early morning for having this session. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dwi Harsono. I'm an associate professor in public administration in Yogyakarta State University. And I'm become the master of ceremony and also the moderator of this session. I already told the audience about the planning for this sessions. First is opening. I did already opening, and the second one is going to be the opening remark from Dr. Marita Ahdiana, the head of Public Administration Department in Yogyakarta State University. And following is the presentation and also the lecturing of Prof. Guy Peters about institutional theory in public administration. And after that, we will follow with question and answer sessions. And then the end is closing statement and from the professor. That's the planning for our session tonight. And for the second session is the opening remark from Dr. Maida Diana. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hasono. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, everyone. I would like to extend my respect to Professor Peters, Maurice Falk Professor of Government at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as to all the lecturers and students from the Department of Public Administration at Universitas Negeri Yogyakarta. First, I want to express my gratitude to the Development Study Club for organizing this guest lecture. A special thank you to Professor Peters. Very good morning to you. It's still early in Pittsburgh, right? We are trying to hear you are doing well, especially after your recent health challenges, and we hope you continue to stay healthy. Today is a great opportunity for our Department of Public Administration and especially for our students. We are delighted to have you with us and grateful for your willingness to share insight on institutionalism theory. Institutionalism is a critical topic for our discussion on institution in Indonesia, particularly regarding policy and institutional arrangement. But as we know, this area has not been widely explored in our context, and there are still limited studies available. We hope your presentation will deepen our understanding of institutionalism and inspire further exploration in this field. Thank you once again to Professor Peters and the Development Study Club for making this event possible. That's all for me. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Mr. Harsono.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marita, for the opening remarks. Before we start, we continue to the lecturing session of institutional theory in public administration by Professor Peters, I just want to give some of note at the first before we joining this session. In my class in economic political course, we have discussed about institutional theory, but still it's in a preliminary level that I think we can deepen the discussion on it by the explanation, by the lecturing of Professor Peters in this event. And it's good for us to have Prof. Peters to have. For myself, I have the experience to learn about institutional theory while I did my master in the Netherlands in 2010 to 2011. We discussed most about new institutionalism and some cases in Indonesia. And I think it's glad to be here for Prof. Peters because several years remaining, we have experienced some of what we call institutional. No, I mean, it's just in just a case that uh, the government of Indonesia, while they doing or while they developing their administration, they make some of institutional change to allow their policies, but some of them as a non-democratic one. And the issue when we talk about public administration, mostly public administration is based on institution, based on regulation to work. But in case of the activities of the work, some of them maybe violate the regulation and then they change it. That's the issue in Indonesian. So I think it's very good for us if we can learn about this topic from Prof. Peters and then follow it with cases and also maybe follow by question and answer to that. Maybe that's the thing that I just want to explain for the early part of this sessions. After this, may Professor Peters to deliver your speech. Maybe I can also explaining in Indonesian bahasa shortly. Profesor Guy Peters ini adalah seorang scholar yang prominent di dunia, khususnya isu masalah institusi, kemudian juga neoliberal dan globalisasi, khususnya demokratisasi dalam globalisasi. Dan yang menjadi menarik adalah ketika bicara institusi ini sangat relevan dengan administrasi publik karena administrasi publik bekerja karena ada institusi. Dalam teori institusi, institusi itu adalah rule and regulation atau aturan main dan peraturan. Sehingga kemudian kalau kita pahami, jadi kalau kita pahami dalam konteks administrasi publik, bahwa kita menyadari betul bahwa administrasi publik itu ketika kemudian bekerja itu mensyaratkan akan adanya peraturan. Peraturan inilah yang kemudian menjadi rambu-rambu kebijakan publik. Ketika kebijakan publik itu adalah kebijakan yang di dalamnya adalah tindakan-tindakan negara untuk menyelesaikan masalah-masalah publik, apa yang terjadi itu harus mengacu kepada rambu-rambu peraturan tadi. Nah, dalam teori yang dikembangkan oleh ilmu atau kemudian teori institusi, institusi itu dipahami, ini bukan yang kita pahami bersama di Indonesia. Di Indonesia kita memahami karena institusi itu sama dengan organisasi. Dalam konteks institusi, dalam konsep teori yang dikembangkan di sini adalah institusi itu dipahami sebagai peraturan dan regulasi atau tata tertib. Sehingga kemudian segala hal yang kemudian di dalamnya ada aturan main atau ada regulasi itu, maka itu kemudian dipahami sebagai institusi. Sehingga kemudian ketika kita berbicara institusi, itu bisa menjadi adalah core dari apa namanya aktivitas yang ada di dalam sebuah organisasi. Sehingga kemudian kadang-kadang eh, apa tidak betul-betul sama, tapi kadang-kadang ketika sebuah organisasi memiliki aturan main, maka disitulah ada institusi. Nah, yang menarik adalah seperti tadi yang saya sampaikan, ketika administrasi publik bekerja, dia harus menyandarkan kepada peraturan yang menjadi rambu-rambu untuk pelaksanaannya. Kemudian ada kebijakan publiknya, dan kebijakan publik inilah yang kemudian dilakukan oleh administrasi publik. Nah, yang menjadi penting adalah kemudian ketika kita bicara tentang administrasi publik dan birokrasi misalkan, yang perlu kita pahami adalah konteks birokrasi itu menyandarkan pada aturan. Fungsi aturan itu ada dua. Pertama, untuk menghindarkan adanya kesewenang-wenangan dari birokrasi, tapi di sisi lain juga menjadi alat apa namanya posisi tawar dari kemudian masyarakat sehingga kemudian masyarakat bisa terlindungi. Ketika kemudian ada kesewenang-wenangan dengan dasar peraturan itulah kemudian warga negara bisa kemudian ketika ada apa tindakan sewenang-wenang atau kemudian merugikan masyarakat bisa mengajukan ke ombudsman dan kemudian misalkan ke PT UN dan lain-lain. Itu adalah salah satu fungsinya. Tapi yang menarik adalah ketika kemudian kita memahami konteks peraturan itu mengontrol atau menjaga agar kemudian eh, birokrasi dan warga negara bisa kemudian apa namanya saling berinteraksi. Yang menjadi problematik adalah ketika ada kepentingan yang dimiliki oleh birokrasi atau kemudian elit atau kemudian dalam hal ini adalah eh, apa namanya penguasa atau eksekutif ketika kemudian dalam konteks tertentu mereka ingin menjalankan agendanya dan agendanya itu kemudian ternyata dalam tanda petik bisa melanggar peraturan atau existing regulation yang ada, maka yang terjadi adalah risikonya kemudian dia apa namanya sebelum dia melakukan itu mereka mengubahnya. Fenomena ini terjadi di negara kita, Bapak Ibu. Jadi mulai tahun terkait dengan perubahan undang-undang Minerba yang diubah tahun 2013-14 kalau tidak keliru. Kemudian undang-undang Cipta Kerja, kemudian undang-undang munculnya Omnibus Law, atau kemudian undang-undang KPK dan lain-lain. Itu kemudian yang namanya administrasi publik, birokrasi, tidak bisa menyalahkan ketika kemudian yang ada adalah institusinya diubah atau peraturannya diubah. Sehingga kemudian dalam konteks ini, inilah yang kemudian menjadi problematik. Nah, yang menjadi menarik selanjutnya adalah sebenarnya ketika kita menyadari itu, apakah kemudian institusinya yang kemudian menjadi yang problematik? Sebenarnya adalah mungkin ini masalah nanti masalah etika yang nanti mungkin juga harapannya rekan-rekan mahasiswa maupun audiens sekalian bisa menjelaskan atau menanyakan kepada Prof. Peters. Nah, itu adalah fenomena yang ada di dalam administrasi publik. Nah, ketika kita bicara tentang teori institusi, satu hal yang dipahami saya di awal menyampaikan bahwa institusi adalah terkait dengan bagaimana kemudian aturan itu ada dan kemudian bisa mempengaruhi perilaku dari individu. Jadi dulu ada teori institusi yang berasal dari behavioralism yang kemudian ketika sekarang fenomenanya sudah sangat kompleks dan kemudian mengarah pada aktivitas politik, teori institusi saat ini banyak kemudian yang berbicara tentang bagaimana kemudian institusi atau yang kita pahami adalah uh, rule and regulation, jadi peraturan maupun tata tertib itu mempengaruhi perilaku politik dari individu. Artinya apa? Tanpa kita sadari, institusi itu kadang-kadang adalah yang sifatnya formal, ada yang sifatnya non formal. Ketika kita melakukan tindakan tertentu, sejauh mana kemudian individu masih mengacu pada aturan-aturan yang itu mengontrol perilakunya. Secara individual, saya misalkan melakukan aktivitas politik, sejauh mana kemudian nilai-nilai atau keputusan yang saya gunakan itu dikontrol oleh nilai-nilai yang kemudian saya pahami sebagai aturan main saya. Itu secara individual. Atau kemudian ketika kita melakukan tindakan-tindakan, kadang-kadang tindakan itu dianggap melanggar norma atau melanggar, mungkin kalau kita yang masih beragama, melanggar aturan-aturan agama, itu juga adalah sama. Itu adalah di level individu. Nah, kalau kita kemudian mengacu pada yang tadi saya sampaikan, sama halnya dengan kemudian bagaimana kemudian kebijakan-kebijakan yang dilakukan oleh negara, atau kemudian katakanlah eh, proses yang ada di dalam administrasi publik itu juga demikian seperti itu. Sejauh mana kemudian aturan main yang ada atau menjadi rambu-rambu dari birokrasi atau administrasi ketika dijalankan itu mempengaruhi individu yang ada di dalamnya. Ketika itu adalah sifatnya adalah organisasi yang komunal, maka kemudian memori organisasi secara keseluruhan. Bagaimana itu bisa terjadi? Nah, disinilah kemudian menjadi penting untuk kita memahami konteks institusi. Dan yang menarik, sayangnya di Indonesia memang teori institusi belum banyak dikaji. Karena apa? Mungkin ini sesuatu yang sebenarnya tidak baru, Bapak Ibu. Kalau teori New Institutionalism memang di awal 2000-an, tapi sebelumnya ada teori institusi juga lebih awal lagi itu sudah muncul. Tapi bagaimana kemudian cara atau kemudian proses yang terjadi sampai kemudian perguliran isu-isu di dalam institusi ini menjadi menarik di Indonesia. I show in the participant list, Prof. Peters is joining. Jadi ini yang diharapkan. Oh ya, it is Prof. Peters. Good evening, Indonesia, Prof. Peters.
Hello, sorry, my machine told me I was supposed to be there 7:30, not 6:30.
Oh, okay.
So fortunately, I saw that you had sent something. So okay, so I'm ready to go when you are.
Okay, maybe I just give you some of note about this session, Prof. Peters. In this session, there are about around 200 students in our university, and also some of them are the because I share these sessions to my colleague as a Indonesian Association for Public Administrations, and also some of them also Indonesian Scholar for Public Administrations. They are joining the sessions too. Then hopefully, I think your lecturing going to be very good for us, especially in Indonesia, because these last remaining years we have some of phenomena on institutional change, especially when the government try to deliver their policy, which is sometimes non-democratic one, and then what happened? They change the regulations, the institution, and then after that they can maybe you already know about Indonesian election and some of the issue about dynasty and everything. And then I think it's really good for us to have you in this session tonight. As explained by the committee, your session going to be about 35 up to 40 minutes, and after that we will continue with question and answer. Okay, the time is yours, Prof. Peters.
Okay, fine, thank you. I will share my screen. Give me a moment here. Okay. Oh, right now, where is the share? There it is. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes, we can see it.
Good, good. Well, again, apologies for the mix-up on timing. I hope you haven't been waiting too long. So, pleasure to be with you this morning or this evening in your case, and to talk a bit about institutional theory in public administration. Now, I'll emphasize the institutional theory part, and then hopefully we can deal with more of the public administration questions in the question and answer session. So all this brings us to one of the big questions in social sciences, which is the difference between structure and agency. So how do we explain how things happen in government or in society as a whole? One way in which we do the explanation is through agency, by individual actions and decisions, and what individuals do as individuals. And most contemporary social science theory is basically based on agency. It's very individualistic. The other way to deal with explanation is to talk about structure, that individuals live within social structures. They live within the law, they live within families, they live within religion, and they also live within governments. And so these social structures, especially formal institutions, then explain the way in which we behave. So we learn how to behave by being a member of an institution. Same thing is true for public administration. We learn how to be a public administrator by working within an institution. Of course, for real explanations, you need both. You need to know about the individuals and you need to know about structure. But personally, as an institutionalist, I'll always start with structure. And the other big question that dealing with institutions and public administration brings up is stability and change, another fundamental dichotomy in the way in which we deal with the social world. So some theories emphasize change. Development theory, for example, is primarily about how to induce change and effective change. Others emphasize stability, and institutional theory and the notion of institutions tends to emphasize stability. Indeed, many people don't like institutional theory because they argue that it's too stable. It focuses too much on stability and doesn't do a good job of explaining change. But again, we need a bit of both. So again, so the stereotype of institutional theory is structure and stability. We look only at structure and we emphasize stability. Now, like all stereotypes, there's some validity to this, but it's not the total truth. It's not the full explanation or description of institutional theory. It's an overstatement of what institutional theory does in terms of how it deals with the political and social world. And in some ways, then, the fundamental question for institutional theory, and to some extent for public administration, is how do structures and individuals interact? That is, when I go into an institution, whether it's my university or government office or whatever, I have to interact with that institution. I have to learn how it works. I have to understand better how it works, and it has to understand me. So if it doesn't understand the people who work for it or its clients, it's not going to do a very good job. So the institution then needs to take into account the nature of the people. And when people change, the institutions, if they're going to be successful, also have to change. And sometimes institutions become very brittle. They become very old and ineffective because they don't deal with changing populations. I can give you some examples later if you wish. So what is a structure? When we're talking about, I was emphasizing structure, but what is it? Okay, it's not just formal so-called brass plaque institutions. By brass plaque, I mean the brass plaques that exist on the side of many government buildings that say the Ministry of X, whatever, agriculture or defense, or legislature or whatever. So those brass plaque institutions we know pretty well. But also they're structures of norms. So we live within structures of norms that are institutions as well. Again, religious norms, family norms, whatever. So we learn how to live with those values and those norms, okay? We also live with structures of incentives and disincentives. So the market as an institution gives us incentives and disincentives to behave in certain ways. And if we behave appropriately, we'll do well economically. If we don't, we won't. Or at least our chances are better if we behave according to those incentives and disincentives. But that's a structure. It's not formal. You can't go and touch it, but it's still a structure. Structures of ideas. So one of the important things I'll mention several times this morning or evening in your case are structures of ideas that essentially then public policies, public administration are based upon ideas and ideas of what good administration is, what a good public policy is. what people should be given, what people should do. So we have ideas, we have pictures in our heads about what good government is, what good public administration is. And these are structures. They define how we should behave and hopefully how we will behave. And these ideas and values and norms and so forth have to be institutionalized. They have to be essentially inculcated into a structure, into an institution. So one of the great sociologists of institutions, Philip Selznick, said that institutionalization is infusing a structure with values greater than those necessary for the mechanical achievement of their task. So in other words, creating an institution is assigning values to the things that we do. So most of us who are here and this morning and evening work in universities. So we think universities have a certain set of values about the pursuit of truth, about educating people, training people for jobs, etc. Okay, so that type of structure, that type of organization is different from something that you're doing simply mechanically. That's flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. It's sort of mechanical. It doesn't have, most people don't have assign a great deal of social value to that. They get a paycheck, but it's not something that they value particularly. Whereas in universities, families, churches, mosque, whatever, we do assign values to what goes on. Okay, but importantly, institutional theory is not monolithic. That is, there is not a single institutional theory. Alas, it would be wonderful if there were. But it tends to be much more diverse and much more differentiated rather than a single set of ideas. So I want to go through relatively quickly a set of 5 options for thinking about institutions. Now, all of these are relevant for public administration, but they're also in some ways, very different. Okay. Now, in terms of the new institutionalism, which, depending on how you want to date it, began in the late 1980s and continues. The first real sort of proclamation of the new institutionalism was made by James March and Johan Olsen. And their version of institutionalism was normative, based upon norms. Secondly, the rational choice institutionalism. I'm going to go through each of these in more detail in a moment, so don't worry. So rational choice institutionalism, which is based upon essentially the assumption that individuals, when they confront an institution, act rationally to try to maximize their own self-interest. Then thirdly, historical institutionalism, based upon essentially the survival of institutions and ideas, particularly over time. Some elements of sociological institutionalism, and then finally empirical institutionalism, based simply upon formal structures. So let me talk about each of these 5 relatively briefly. I could go on for hours and hours, but I won't. Anyway, so first, normative institutionalism. Now, March and Olsen, in their classic book, argued that essentially what we're looking at is the difference between the logic of appropriateness and a logic of consequentiality. So when you have to make a decision on your job or in your daily life, for that matter, how do you make that decision? So they argue that most social science theory is based upon a logic of consequentiality. That is, what are the consequences of my action? What do I get out of it? Will I be rewarded? Will I be punished? So you examine then rationally the choices. They argue that, however, that institutions are better understood through a logic of appropriateness. What sort of behavior is appropriate for acting within that institution. And so they argue then that individuals within institutions react to and this is part of the litany that they had of myths, symbols, routines, values that exist within an institution. And again, if we take the university, we all have symbols that we have about university life, etc. So we basically base our decisions, they argue, on what's appropriate for the situation. Now, and we're also all members of many institutions. So we have to understand that what's appropriate in one may not be appropriate in another. So we have to change the way in which we behave in order to fit into various different institutions. Now, so the notion here is that individual preferences, what we want, are endogenous. That is, we learn them within the institution. We have some basic values, but we learn how to behave within the institution. And we're different as people because we live within an institution, whether it's the university, a public office, whatever. And these values are reproduced through socialization. So when you go to work in your agency, for the first time, you begin to be taught, you begin to be socialized. You learn how to be a good civil servant. You learn how to behave appropriately. And so therefore, the institution reproduces itself by constantly retraining and socializing individuals who become members of the institution. And the normative version is largely internally oriented. It's largely oriented toward controlling the individuals and their behavior within the institution. And institutions have varying bounds of appropriateness. So the military, for example, would have very strict bounds of appropriateness. You have to do exactly the right things at the right time. Whereas universities tend to be very lax about what's appropriate. And sometimes the less appropriately you behave, the more intelligent you're thought to be. So universities are very loose. Militaries are very strict. Public administration is somewhere in between. Okay, second version is rational choice institutionalism. And here preferences are exogenous. That is, you come into the institution with a set of preferences. And the assumption is that the dominant preference is utility maximization. You are a rational economic actor, and you're attempting to maximize your own personal utility by being involved in the institution. So that's clear in a market. You go to work in a market situation in order to earn money. But the argument here is that we behave in other types of institutions in very much the same way. And that we're always trying to maximize our own self-interest, either economically or in terms of prestige or power or whatever. Now, in rational choice institutionalism has a variety of different variants. I won't go into them all now in the interest of time. But if we want to go back to them, we can later. But the two to talk about particularly are Elinor Ostrom, Nobel laureate in economics, who really said the institutions basically were defined by rules. And if you follow the rules, you'll be fine. And individuals will learn that, again, and their incentive is to be successful. So they follow the rules. And the other one that's more structural is George Sibelius, talked about institutions being defined by veto points, where you have to win in order if you want to get what you want from the situation. Now, the important thing about rational choice, though, is that change is very easy. So normative institutionalism, change is difficult. For rational choice institutionalism, change is easy. If you change the incentives and disincentives, people will behave appropriately, will behave as you want them to, because you understand their preferences, and you can manipulate them by changing incentives and disincentives. So it's much easier to change. Thirdly, historical institutionalism. The notion here is that institutions then are path dependent. There's a formative moment when you make the institution. And then you better be careful when you're making that institution, because what you do then is likely to persist. So the notion of path dependency. So once you start down a path, you continue down the path. Sometimes you do that even if it's dysfunctional. So I don't know about Indonesian keyboards and typewriters and computer keyboards, but at least in the English-speaking world, we use what's called a QWERTY keyboard. So it's QWERTY. Now, the QWERTY keyboard was designed for manual typewriters in the old days, because it essentially took into account how often letters were used and tried to reduce the chances of jamming of two keys going up together. So it made a lot of sense in 1900. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in 2024. But it continues because the costs of changing it and the cost of retraining people are too great. So we persist then in this really inefficient keyboard system simply because that's what we've always done. And a lot of institutions are like that. They simply persist and are difficult to change. And historical institutionalism is largely based upon ideas. So you have an idea about something, and that produces then a continuing a repetition of those ideas. And then there's a variety of ways of change. The original version of change in historical institutionalism was so-called punctuated equilibrium. That is, we go along, for years with one way of doing things, an equilibrium. And then there's a massive shift, and almost revolutionary change. So change in the original versions of HI was largely, again, almost revolutionary. And it was actually based upon Darwinian or post-Darwinian biology, looking at the idea then of that essentially evolution didn't occur nice and neat and linearly. It occurred in spurts. So anyway, fourthly, is sociological institutionalism. I've already mentioned Philip Selznick and the importance of values. Patricia Thornton et al. Have talked about institutional logics, so that institutions then have logics that are sets of values and ideas that you learn. And there are multiple logics within an institution. So there's an economic logic, there's a managerial logic, there's a social logic. Now, this is very similar to the normative version, but it's developed different tracks. I won't belabor this again in the interest of time. And then finally, we have what most people think of as institutionalism. That is the empirical institutions. That is the formal structures. So for the difference, for example, between presidential and parliamentary governments. And variations within that Aaron Leipart has talked about. So when we look at these sort of formal structural elements, what difference do they make for the way in which things happen? Federal versus unitary states. And the same thing, you can find the same sort of thing within public administration. That is, you look at the formal structures of public administration, whether they are formal in the sense of organograms of organizational designs or ideas. So, for example, my book on administrative traditions is really talking about the influence of ideas rather than formal structure on outcomes. But what we're looking at here, though, are the way in which these formalized, empirical, identifiable structures shape outcomes. Okay, then finally, I've been talking about formal structure, but particularly since Helmke and Levitsky We've been also interested in the importance of informal structures that may support or oppose institutions. This goes back to an old idea in the sociology of organizations about informal organization. So that an organization may have a formal set of rules, but the workers within the organization develop their own rules. And they develop their own ways of doing things that may or may not support the formal purpose of the organization. So within the public administration, for example, patronage, giving people jobs outside the merit system, is a well-established informal institution. In some cases, it's formalized, but in many governments, it's informal. And I've been doing a lot of work on patronage appointments and politicization over the last several years. And one sees how important this informal institution is in explaining the success or failure of public organizations. So we live with a lot of these informal institutions within public administration, within government in general. So within all these different notions about institutions, and again, sorry to have to go through them so fast. So if you have questions, let me know. But within those, is there anything that's common? And I argue that there is. First of all, is the notion that individuals are not atomistic. Their behavior is shaped by institutions, so that they're not just individuals deciding things on their own, living on their own, to make choices, but they're just to a great extent making choices based upon their being involved with institutions. And you can't understand fully that how they behave, unless you understand their institutional memberships. Secondly, all versions of institutionalism create some predictability and regularities of behavior. So one simple definition of an institution is essentially regular behavior. So if you decide to have tea with your best friend at 4 o'clock every Tuesday afternoon, that's an institution. It creates a regular behavior. Now, it's not a grand institution like the legislature, but it's still institutionalized behavior because there are rules. You're supposed to be there. It's very regular. You're not acting as an atomistic individual. You're acting as a member of a group. So even small things that we do on a day-to-day basis can be thought of in institutional terms. And then finally, institutions are embedded in an environment of other institutions. So if we look at public administration, we think of it as an institution, but it's embedded in systems of law. It's embedded in systems of social values. It's embedded in ideas about government. So every institution then is involved in an environment that is largely composed of other institutions. Now, okay. I said at the beginning that one of the important ways in which institutions, one of the important questions about institutions is how do individuals and institutions interact? And I've talked about this already. We can go back, but I'd better go ahead, because this may be what you were wanting to hear anyway, is to talk about applying these institutional theories to public administration. And we do this implicitly all the time, particularly for the empirical institutionalism. So we're assuming then that structures matter. So we're constantly changing structures. We constantly reform. It's just, the Romans did it, the Greeks did it before the Romans. Since there have been governments, there's been attempts to devise the perfect structure for government and for public administration. Now, the problem is that the answer is that there is no perfect structure. It all depends on what you want to do, when, how, and with whom. But anyway, so if we want to think about the impact of structures, a good example is the agency model coming out of New Public Management. So the assumption was that if you break up large ministerial structures, large departments, into a number of smaller agencies, each with a single purpose, then those agencies will be more efficient and more accountable than they were within the large ministerial model. And that idea was originally came from Sweden in the late 18th century, but was popularized by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and spread around the world. So I'm not sure, but you probably have an agency model in some ways in Indonesia. Or certainly you'll have some. If you don't, it's very unusual. But anyway, so the assumption here is if you change the structure, you change the behavior. So you're applying an institutional theory. Also, we can also think about this in terms of ideas. So, and values. So two good examples of that are the public value model from Mark Moore, and thinking about essentially then that the role of the public administrator is to create public value, to create good things for people and for the citizens. The other and related idea is the public service motivation from Jim Perry and Annie Hungham. The idea here then that individuals go into government because of their values. They're basically motivated to do good things for their fellow citizens. You know, they want a decent living, they want a salary, etc. But their basic motivation is public service. Now, so here then, here is a structure of values that explains behavior, why individuals choose to be civil servants, why they choose to join public administration. Okay. Path dependency, the reform literature, which is massive, as I implied a few moments ago. The reform literature basically is arguing that that organizations persist and behaviors persist unless someone does something about it. And secondly, that it's very difficult to change behavior. So reforms tend to go on, and most reforms fail. Sorry, not to disappoint you this evening, but most reforms beget new reforms. And then finally, the sociological model and values. So I don't know if you've seen it or not, but two colleagues and I just did a paper on the Guardian state. And the argument here is that in an era of populist mobilization, it's important that civil servants then have the values of protecting the Constitution and protecting the state. So that the institutional logic then for public administration should be to protect constitutional values and civil values. So should we apply institutional theory more explicitly? Of course so. That's my job. So that's what I've been doing for a lot of my life, is trying to think about how to do this. But the theory does give us guidance. It gives us a way to understand how people behave and how the ways in which they should behave, what to look for. And I presented you 5 options in terms of institutional theories, but we can use these together. They needn't be kept in watertight compartments. They can work together. And for example, I think for me at least, the March and Olson version of it, norms and values, really should be involved in almost any thinking about public administration and about government. So here are a few examples of administrative reform based upon the various forms of institutionalism. So normative institutionalism, changing values, trying to change policies. So Lester Solomon for example, argued some years ago that when you reorganize government, you shouldn't expect efficiency. So a lot of our administrative reforms have to do with efficiency. So Solomon said, don't expect efficiency. What you can get, though, is a change in policy, because people then are in contact with different values, different ideas. And Niels Brunson talks about essentially the normative basis of never-ending reform. So again, one reform begets the next reform. In part because what many of the things that we deal with in public administration are dichotomies. And the two ends of the dichotomy both of them look good. So specialization and coordination, for example. So we say that specialization is good. So we want organizations that focus on a single topic. But we also know that all those organizations that focus on those specific topics have to work together, particularly to provide services to the public. So coordination is important. So specialization, coordination, how do you put them together? And the answer is generally we don't. We go back and forth. So I did a book with Gerard Burkhardt and Koen Verhulst on this issue in 10 European countries. And we mapped over a 40-year time span how governments went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, constantly between specialization and coordination. And there's a never-ending cycle. Anyway, secondly, rational choice institutionalization, RC is rational choice. How do we change structures to get what we want? So rational choice institutionalism talks more about design and argues that we can in fact design organizations and institutions to get what we want, because individuals will always be utility maximizers. Historical institutionalism is really focused on change. Interestingly, its basic notion is path dependency, but it's also very interested in change. Sociological is more value-oriented, and empirical institutionalism tends to examine the effects of those institutional structures and of reform. So again, a lot of the reform literature in public administration is looking at what changes in structures have done to the way in which organizations behave. So what do institutionalizations don't do? First of all, they don't explain change very well. They are better at explaining stability. So some, as I've said, like historical institutionalism, have become almost obsessed with the ideas of change, but yet they're better at describing than they are at explaining change. So if we want to deal with change, we have to go elsewhere. Likewise, institutional theory doesn't do a very good job of predicting, other than to predict that things will stay the same. So it's very good at explaining persistence, but not very good at explaining change. And doesn't really do a very good job of explaining decision-making very well. So decision-making is perhaps fundamentally individual. So there's a famous story in Washington, D.C. about a senator was sitting in his office at the Capitol building, and his aide comes rushing in to talk to the senator. And he says, Senator, the White House is calling. And the senator said, son, buildings don't make phone calls. And likewise, institutions don't make phone calls. Institutions don't make decisions. Individuals within them make decisions. So if we really want to get down to the individual decision-making level, or to thinking about how a policy is made, how a rule is applied, whatever, then we begin to have to get down to talk about individuals and agency. So again, we need both. Institutions give us a good start for understanding, but if we want to get down into the weeds and talk about really decisions being made, we have to think about individuals. So So institutional theory then is a very valuable strand of social theory, not as yet unified, lots of ideas, some common features, but it's certainly relevant for public administration. It certainly tells us a lot about how structures and ideas matter for the way in which public organizations work. So this has been a very quick run through, unfortunately, but hopefully it'll give you some ideas about thinking about institutions, institutional theory. And again, I apologize for being late, but just a slip up in terms of the timing. So I look forward to questions. Thank you.
I want to question you, Professor.
Yep,
Is
Okay,
that
thank you very
okay?
much,
Is that okay?
Prof. Peters.
sure.
Okay, now is the question and answer sessions. If you want to make a question, please raise your hand. For the first session for the question and answer, I invite 3 of the question from the floor. Okay, the first one is Mr. Rifadi. Is there any?
Right. Yes. Firstly, I want to be apologized, but this discussion seems to be cannot be me can comprehend. So if I may bold where this can be applied and why this is necessary to be applied. And third question is there any difference if applied on developed or developing nation, or this can be applied universally? Thank you.
Well, to me, this in any social theory is, first of all, a way of understanding. And then once one understands, one can apply. So I think, if we always are dealing with a theory implicitly or explicitly. And the notion of thinking about this explicitly is to make the choices that have to be made clearer. For example, do you want to deal with formal sort of organograms of organizations? Do you want to, is the best way to approach organizations talking about values or norms or ideas? Okay. So I think it is applicable. First of all, if you don't understand what's going on, you won't be able to reform or change or do the job well. Secondly, in terms of applicable to developed and less developed countries. Within bounds, yes. I mean, the values may be different, the challenges may be different, but one can understand these ideas, I think, or use these ideas equally well. Example, the book of Aaron McDonald on policymaking in Ghana, or really on organizational behavior in Ghana, uses basically normative institutional theory and uses it very well to understand how this African country functions and how it has attempted to reform. So I think these ideas can be applied. Now, they won't be applied in exactly the same way, but they certainly are applicable. Okay?
Right. Thank you for your answer, professors.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Shahrul. You can say it in Bahasa. I will translate it to Prof. Peters. Okay, I think it's better for the one who raised their hand first. Before at the end, this last session, I will read the question from the chat room. Now the third question from Rofino. You can open your mic.
All right. Thank you, sir. I guess my question are quite bit long, so I send it on chat room. Thank you, sir.
Okay, you put on the okay. So I will read it later. And now goes to Davin. Yeah, you can have your questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dwi. Uh, Good evening, Mr. Peters.
Hello?
Before before I very apologize in advance if my English speaking is not perfect. I'm sorry, but I hope you can understand, Mr. Uh, okay, let me
Yep.
introduce myself. My name is Davin Bildas Gunawan. You can call me Davin. I'm part of the class of 2022 in Public Administration at Yogyakarta State University. I have a question for you about how is institutional theory applied in developed countries like the United States, especially based on your experience, and how might the theory be adapted to the context of developing countries like ours, Indonesia, that's for sure with a different political and administrative system. Thank you, Mr. Peter.
Yep. Okay. Well, to me, the understanding of institutions is the same. That is, if you want, so the institutional theory, let's take March and Olson, for example, the normative institutionalism. Okay, it asks the question, okay, what values, myths, symbols, routines determine the way in which organizations behave and the ways in which individuals within them behave. Okay, so there's this fundamental notion then that behavior of individuals in government or in any other organization, institution, are determined by myths, symbols, values, routines. So the task then for the researcher, whether it's in the United States, Indonesia, wherever, is to figure out what those values are. So if he or she is trying to understand behavior in the politicians in the U.S. or administrators in the U.S. or the behavior of administrators in Indonesia, the first thing you have to do is to figure out what values they're using and how they think about the organizations. Now, so fundamentally then what you're trying to, what you will find, I think, or what would explain the difference then within those, using that sort of approach, is you'll find people may have different values. That they may, for example, be more willing to tolerate patronage and politicization of the bureaucracy. They're be more interested in providing benefits to family members. Again, some of the work that I've been doing with a friend in Kazakhstan, which is sort of intermediate. Everything is there. Everything, so much of the administration is based upon family membership. Okay, so there's a case where the value of family and clan is more important than the sort of public service values or the value around merit appointments that would be more common in a more developed country. So the underlying values then are crucial for understanding what's going on. Now, other versions, for example, rational choice theory would be arguing that individuals are the same, that they have a common motivation of maximizing self-interest, and that they and so all you have to do is manipulate the incentives, and you can get their same behaviors, the behavior you want, whether it's in Jakarta or Washington. So it depends upon how you want to see the world in terms of how common individuals are in terms of their values or how different they are. Okay?
Thank you, Mr.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Sarju. You can open your mic.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Prof. Harsono, for giving me the floor. I really appreciate it, and I also thank the organizers of this event. And thirdly, Professor, I have to thank you for your eloquent and insightful discussion with regards to this topic. I think it's really helpful. I am Sajid Dabo from Gambia. I'm an international student in Universitas Negeri Yogyakarta. So it's really a privilege to meet with you here and ask you some of these questions. Basically, I have just two questions. And my first question is, what are some of the complexities faced by institutions regarding institutional theory? And my second question is, how can practitioners effectively apply these theoretical concepts in real-world setting, especially when faced with a lot of institutional pressures? So these are my questions. I hope you get them. Thank you.
Okay. Let me start with the second one. Again, I think it's rather similar to the question that was asked earlier about applications. So the first thing to make any sort of change or to manage an institution or an organization is to understand what's going on. And the primary purpose then of the institutional approaches are to provide an understanding of what's going on. Whether you want to deal with this formally or whether you want to deal with it in terms of values, norms, whatever. But if you don't understand what's going on, and if you don't have a consistent way of approaching what's going on, you won't be able to be effective in managing. Now, so management theory, to some extent, some parts of management theory are based upon institutional models. So if you read, for example, the Academy of Management Review, which is largely private sector, but also public sector, a lot of their articles are about institutional theory and institutional ideas. So, and again, it's a way of getting inside the organization and the institution. Now, can you repeat your first question, please?
Darbo, are you there?
You
About
mean-
the complexities of
the complexities, yeah, yeah.
institution on institution theory, yes. How to apply
Okay.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
Exactly.
Okay, so the world's a complex place, very complex place. And theory is a way to attempt to cut through the complexity. So Herbert Simon, Nobel laureate in economics, but also a distinguished public administration scholar, talked about the blooming, buzzing confusion of the world. So an institution is a very confusing, complex structure or entity. So the importance then of theories is to cut through some of that complexity. Sometimes it gives you overly simple answers because you are discarding lots of things that you may really need to know. But the reason that I think that in thinking about institutional theory is important is that it enables you then to cut through some of the confusion and complexity and get at some fundamental issues about what happens within an institution. Now, when you do that, though, you're forced to make choices. That is, which version of institutionalism. Or better yet, you can try to use several to see what different sorts of ideas they give you. So I don't know if you ever come across Graham Allison's book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he argues in favor of triangulation, that is using multiple approaches to examine the same institution or the same set of decisions, trying to figure out what each version tells you that's different, and then how you develop a composite picture. Now, so dealing with the complexity is extremely difficult. And political science, public administration, for the most part, hasn't been terribly good in dealing with complexity. We've at times been overly simplistic, but at the same time, that simplicity has virtues.
Okay, Turbo.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. The following question from Yoga Nur Cahya. You can open your mic.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Before that, can you hear my voice clearly?
Yes, we can hear it clearly.
So my question is, what do you consider the most significant or important influence on institutional theory in public administration today, Mr. Professor Peter? This is my question.
Okay.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Okay. I'm a Martin Olson guy. I've worked with Johan Olson and over the years. So I'm basically interested primarily in the normative approaches to institutional theory. So, and in part of the foundation for the normative theories is bounded rationality. So if you look at rational choice theory that I mentioned as I went through, it has a very simple idea about individuals maximizing their self-interest. The bounded rationality, which goes back, in fact, to Herbert Simon, argues that we're not that smart. The world is too difficult. The world is too complex. So therefore, we always are making decisions on the basis of bounded rationality. So those bounds are set by your culture, the difference between developed and less developed countries, your political system, etc. So there's no single answer. But again, the importance in here is understanding those bounds and understanding then the way in which those imperfect decisions can be made and then remade. So, to some extent, criticizing the reform literature because reform continues and continues and continues. But at the same time, that is perhaps the only way to really achieve reform is to do it gradually, to do it bit by bit, to make one reform, see how it works, reevaluate it, go on to the next reform, rather than making grand sweeping changes that often then fail and fail miserably. Okay.
Thank you for the answer, Professor.
Next question from Haliza.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. Just last month, preciously on October, the new president of the Republic of Indonesia was officially elected, as well as the list of the ministers. There are many changes in the structure of the government, including the Minister of Education. Finally, the government separated basic education from higher education, especially universities. And what is interesting is the presence of the new Deputy Minister of Higher Education. She is a professor who already has a name at one of the universities in China. She wants to change the mindset of Indonesian by emphasizing that higher education is about creating new knowledge, new technology. My question is how to create something new in public administration, especially since public administration is closely related to institutions that have long been known to be rigid and difficult to change. Thank you very much.
So you're asking then, can we expect her to be successful? I mean, I don't know enough about the specifics of the case, but as you rightly said, you've almost answered your own question. That is, you're dealing with institutions that are difficult to change because they are value-based. And changing values is hard. Now, once you change values, they tends to be more lasting than merely changing structures. But changing values are hard. Changing values is hard. And again, if we think about this in terms of normative institutionalism and changing values, there's several arguments that are made about how the change occurs. One is when the institutions fail to deliver on their own promises. So if higher education is meant to provide Indonesians with certain outcomes that are better for them, and it's not, then change has to come, whether from internally or externally. The second is when the raw material of the institution, that is individuals in this case, changes. So institutions then which are faced with clients or citizens who want different things than the old clients did, generational changes, changes in interest in technology, et cetera. When they change, then the institutions, if they want to be successful, have to change. So I think your Minister of Higher Education has a very difficult task ahead, but hopefully she will think about ways to which to change the values within the institutions.
Okay, thank you. For the next question, Danny Egison, you can open mic for it.
Okay, thank you. Let me introduce myself. My name is Danny Egita, a student of public administration from the class of 2022. I would like to try asking directly in English, but due to my limited English skill, so I will prefer to use Indonesia. Jadi mungkin nanti saya bisa minta bantuan Pak Harsono ya buat menjelaskan tentang
Okay, I'll
apa
translate it. It's fine. Yeah.
yang saya tanyakan. Tadi kan Prof. Peters itu menjelaskan bahwa dalam teori institusi, struktur, dan regulasi itu bertujuan untuk menciptakan stabilitas dan mencegah penyalahgunaan wewenang dalam administrasi publik. Namun dalam konteks ini yang agak ramai sekarang, Tom Lembong ya. Dalam kasus Tom Lembong ini muncul pandangan bahwa kebijakan yang diambil pejabat publik itu tidak seharusnya dipidana, meskipun mungkin saja berdampak negatif. Jadi pertanyaannya, bagaimana pandangan Prof. Peters terhadap batasan antara kebijakan yang dianggap sebagai diskresi pejabat dan tindakan yang dianggap melanggar hukum? Apa yang seharusnya ada mekanisme khusus dalam institusi untuk menilai akuntabilitas kebijakan tanpa mengkriminalisasinya, khususnya dalam sistem politik di negara berkembang? Thank you, Mr. Peters.
Okay, I'll try to translate it to Prof. Peters. The question is about, if you mentioned that structure and regulation is to creating stability in institution and organization. The issue in Indonesia is about how then providing authorities based on discretion, and also how then this measured as a violation or not, because it's not based on the regulation. That's the question about it.
Yeah, good question. So one of the problems in any administrative system is discretion. So again, and there's another one of these dichotomies. On the one hand, you want to control the individual administrator as he or she makes decisions. On the other hand, you want to give those administrators a certain amount of discretion to deal with clients. So it's a problem to a great extent for street level bureaucracy, that is the lower echelons of the bureaucracy, who have to confront clients on a day-to-day basis and make decisions. Now, so to some extent, this is a question of which types of decisions can you allow discretion? So questions that deal with fundamental rights of citizens, justice, etc. Certainly one doesn't want to have a great deal of discretion. Other types of decisions, what sort of grade do you get in a public university, for example? The individual street level bureaucrat, the professor, should have a lot of discretion because that's his or her job. So yeah, there's no single answer. It depends a lot upon the nature of the choices being made. And also, this is a management question also, because individuals at the street level want to have some power and authority of their own. They don't want to be merely cogs in a great big machine. They want to be able to make decisions, help clients, etc. So if you remove all discretion, it's demotivating for public servants. So it's both a management question and a question then of citizens' rights and what they have the right to expect from their government.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. The last question from the audience to open mic is from Ahmad Faisal. We have a limited time up to 8 p.m. here, so it's about just 4 minutes. So can you deliver your question shortly, Ahmad?
Oke, terima kasih Pak. Tapi sebelumnya mohon maaf, saya bakal ngomong bahasa Indonesia karena keterbatasan kemampuan saya.
Pendek aja ya Mas ya.
Jadi kan sebagai Bapak Profesor Peter tadi yang dia berada di luar negeri, bagaimana pandangan profesor tersebut terhadap keadaan Indonesia sekarang, terkhusus dalam pemerintahannya setelah adanya pemilu di tahun 2024? Terima kasih.
The question is about your comment about Indonesian political situation after the election, because as you know, we have an issue on political dynasty, and then how the former ruler in Indonesia changed this institution and allowing it to happen, even in the Reformation era. You can have any comment about it?
I don't know enough to say anything intelligent about that, so
okay.
I'll choose not to. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. It's fine. Yeah. Okay, because it's quite tricky in it.
Yeah.
We have about we had about 3 minutes left, but actually there are 7 questions in the chat room. So I'll pick the first question is before said, but it's about the implementation of democratic institution in Indonesia. It's from Sahrul, but unfortunately, the implementation sometimes kind of what it's here impacted to the underprivileged communities. Kind of they should have properly, but actually they suffering from it. Do you have any comment about that?
Well, again, I don't know the circumstances to be, but on the other hand, I mean, it's this question of implementation, discretion. Just it's twofold, sort of problem. One is one's trying to, within an organization, a public organization, trying to provide for equality and across all citizens. So one of the purposes for democratic institutions would be to promote the equality of individuals and the equality of services. On the other hand, when you implement and give individuals discretion, it's very difficult to produce equality because individual administrators make up their own minds. They provide have their own ideas about what is the appropriate type of policy. So again, it's a balancing problem. It's always, so much of what we do in the public sector is balancing sets of values. So discretion is good, equality is good. How do you put the two together? And there's no perfect answer, alas. I mean, I wish there were.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Peters. unfortunately, we're now stepping on 8 p.m. and this is yeah, unfortunately, there are about another 6 questions, but maybe next time if we have any other
Okay.
maybe the community from the development study club can collect those questions and maybe send it to you if you want to answer it.
That would
Okay,
be fine.
okay. Before we finish this sessions, maybe you have closing remarks for it.
No, well, thanks very much for the questions. Very good questions, interesting questions. Challenging, so you've given me some things to think about. So thanks so much, and I hope it's been useful for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Guy Peters, for delivering your speech and answering some of questions from the students and the audience. And for me myself, it's very interesting for your explanation because there are so many questions actually because I did my master and also my PhD about historical institution in Indonesia. I learned about it a lot. That yeah, we have a limited time to discuss more. Hopefully, we can still continue to discussion. I will ask your contact to the committee, so maybe we can discuss more by online or with emails. For me, thank you very much for the audience for finishing this meeting. Do we need to have a picture, Mas Riza? Okay, can you please open your camera? I'll take a picture for the first screen. Okay, the second one. The third one. I just taking picture for the picture who opened their camera. So thank you very much for opening your camera. This is the end of our sessions. The very gratitude for Professor Guy Peters for having this delivering this speech, and also for all of the audience in this public lecturing. Hopefully it's benefiting to your understanding and your knowledge about institutional theory. Actually, it's very close to what happened in Indonesia. And I think it's also giving Prof. Peters some more engaged in Indonesian issue, because actually there is a changing on institution to deliver what the political elites to gain their objectives in their political activities. And thank you very much. I think it's the end of our sessions. I will close. Thank you. Bye-bye. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you.
Terima kasih Pak
Thank
Dwi.
you.